Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this webinar of the Conservative Group for Europe, which we're going to keep tight, try to do within an hour. We have some really good submitted questions, which I am going to read out when our speakers have spoken. If you have anything you want to add, there is a chat facility and you are most welcome to use it. And if there is time, I will try to aggregate any questions with the help of Simon Saunders, and we will endeavour to get one or two of those in. But I don't want to raise your hopes too much because I'm conscious that this tends to slip a little bit. Now, we are extraordinarily privileged to have this evening the participation of Ian Wright, who's the Chief Executive of the Food and Drinks Federation. He was previously with the Communications Director with Diageo, and prior to that, he worked for Pillsbury, Burger King, and Mars, both in consultancy and as their public affairs face. And we also have Fergus McReynolds, public affairs expert, who works for MakeUK, which was previously the Engineering Employers Federation, and therefore absolutely the heart of a British industry and its policies. And prior to that, he was a senior climate change advisor as well. Now, I'm going to ask Ian to speak first. The topic is really the future of industry and trade for the United Kingdom, taking in both COVID and obviously Brexit and the interplay between those two things. And so I'm going to ask both our speakers to try to keep their remarks to 10 minutes. I'm not a martinet, so if there's a bit of an overrun, we can live with that, but try and keep it to 10 minutes, and then we will follow it with the questions and answers. So, Ian, over to you.
Dominic, thank you very much. And it's a privilege, actually, to make my debut in front of a Conservative Party audience at the age of 62. And I think 46 years since I first joined a political party, which wasn't the Conservative Party. And I actually have to say I've never been a member of the Conservative Party, though I'm pleased to see on your attendance list, apart from your chairman, who I think is the most extraordinarily distinguished figure, and possibly one of the bravest and most impressive figures in British politics of the last 20 years, maybe longer, actually. I'm also pleased to see two university contemporaries, at least, in the shape of David Lidington and Tim Skeet, in their own ways, no less distinguished, indeed, very distinguished. And somewhere in the undergrowth is my mate and colleague, Tim Rycroft, who will be texting me if I've said the wrong thing. So if I suddenly veer off in the middle of the sentence, Prime Minister-like, you will know that the text has come from Dominic Cummings to stop me saying what I wanted to say, particularly around committing to timetables, which I gather is now anathema. So I'm going to be very brief, really, and talk about what I think the impact of COVID-19 is on industry, and I think first of all, I'm seized by but disagree with your distinguished colleague Matthew Parris, who said that he thought that the impact was being massively overdone about 3 weeks ago in one of his brilliant Saturday pieces. He said he thought the impact was being overdone and that things would return to pretty close to where they had been as soon as practical. And I think he may have said when there's a vaccine, or probably more likely when there are therapeutic treatments that become available. And I do think he has one point. I disagree with the central thrust, but I think his one point that people's ability to absorb an extraordinary change in their living circumstances and to move on is really remarkable. But I don't think that this is a one-off change. I think this is a substantial intersection in the way in which business and society interact, and it will repose new responsibilities on industries and on businesses, and it will also change the relationship, I think, of the citizen, or in my case, the shopper, with the businesses which serve them, and with the government which oversees all of this. And I mean, I speak, as Dominic said, with kind of experience of being in business for a very long time, and having been involved in two of the biggest and most respected businesses in the world. Boots the Chemists, which was a fantastically successful business in the 1990s and noughties, led by a brilliant conservative, actually, James Blythe, or Blythe of Rowington, one of my heroes. And then Diageo, also led by a brilliant conservative, Paul Walsh, probably the most respected business in Britain in the noughties and early teens of this year, and certainly probably the most successful consumer goods business. And both of those businesses survived extraordinarily and prospered on the back of brilliant management, fantastic leadership, ruthless financial management, a strong commitment to cash, never forget the cash, and most important, a total commitment to the respect and mutual respect of their customers and shoppers. If I can put it in the vernacular, we never took the piss out of the customers and the shoppers, and they loved us in both cases for it. And I think that's an important lesson for politicians as well, particularly politicians who might be leading the country at moments of great national crisis. And I think so far, the relationship between government and business and the people has been relatively undisturbed. And indeed, I think most people would say that the British people have been relatively obedient of the instructions issued to them, even those issued to them by Matthew Hancock. And they have been extremely careful and extremely responsible. And to some of us who have dealt with them as shoppers and customers over the last 30 years, that isn't a surprise, because we knew that's how they behaved in most circumstances. And we certainly knew that that's how the majority of them behaved. I think the question of the future depends a lot on how we all behave next as we come out of this. Now, I was asked to say something about how the food industry has shown up in all of this. And I think you have to say, although I'm obviously biased, that food and drink has put the food and drink industry, from farmers through manufacturers, who I represent, through to retailers and all those who support the industry, very important people in packaging, in distribution, all of those people have really put their lives and their careers on the line to deliver for the British people. So with one or two exceptions, and if you want, I can talk about why there were empty shelves at the very start of this. With one or two exceptions, the performance has been extraordinary. And my particular part of the forest has had 500,000 people working every day, many cases 6 shifts a week, to produce at levels never before seen. So just a couple of statistics. The average production, or what happened, just to say, what happened in March was that the 30% of British food that is produced for out of home, that's contract catering, hospitality, and what I would say was food to go, so pret-a-manger. That 30% walked across the road in 2 weeks at the beginning of March to start shopping in retail. And of course that caused disruption, because retail's just-in-time system is based on algorithms which take last week's behaviour and project it into next week, which is fine until last week's behaviour is no predictor of who the customers are or where they are next week. And we cope very well with that, I think. And I think the two extraordinary facts about that coping have been these. One is the supply chains of the 40% of food that we import into this country regularly have been sustained with very little disruption. Italy, Spain, France, all those countries with whom in some ways we are currently in a very antagonistic situation, but not with the companies and people who those governments represent, have performed astonishingly, even during their own lockdowns, to keep us totally supplied. So we've had a run on pasta, and we've had a run on flour. Britain has gone baking-tastic. But apart from that, we have not seen serious shortages so far. And that is a huge tribute to the people who drive, the people who make those products in those countries, but also the people who bring them here, and to the model of European integration that has been sustained over 40 years. It works. It continues to work. The other thing is that we've had 500,000 people at work every day for the last 9 weeks. And our absence rate started at 20% and are now under 5 on average, 5%. And more than half of those people aren't COVID related. So that is an extraordinary tribute too. It also tells you, interestingly enough, we have no idea really about the infection rates in those factories, all of which have had massive changes in terms of social distancing. But what we do know is that from the ONS statistics that were up to the end of April, the number of deaths in the food manufacturing industry directly related to COVID-19 was under 30, which is an extraordinary fact. Now, what the track and tracing system and all of those things and the resumption of work will do is not clear to us. But what I do want to finish with is this. In those circumstances, the people who work in the food industry have put a great deal of time and trouble into serving the people who are their shoppers and customers. And those customers, I think, are broadly pretty grateful. They haven't been clapping the food industry in the way that tonight, in a minute, they'll be clapping the NHS or the social care workers, and that's not surprising. But we do get a great deal of approbation in supermarkets and in shops and in takeaways. That relationship is one of mutual respect. It is important for all businesses as they resume work, knowing the depression that we're about to go into, where potentially 5 million, 6 million, maybe more people unemployed, massive disruption to people's livelihoods that's on a scale that we haven't seen yet and is not insulated in the way that it has been. So people are not insulated from it as they have been so far. The mutual respect that we have managed to maintain is going to be critical for all businesses to maintain as they go forward. And it is equally important that the government maintains it. And in the process of unlocking the lockdown, it's vital that, if I can be really political, Dominic, in a specific sense, it's vital to our futures as businesses, that as much as is possible is done to maintain the respect between customers, shoppers and business, and the relationship of respect between people and government, and that people are not given a reason to disrespect government. Because if this lockdown has to be reimposed, the damage done, not just to lives, which is evident as we've seen, but to livelihoods for the very, very long term, for a generation and more, will be absolutely impossible to repair, and certainly not in our lifetimes. So I think the stakes are pretty high, and I think while we've achieved a lot so far, it's perfectly possible that we could, as a country, screw it up in the next few weeks. And I would be particularly heartbroken if that happened. Thanks for listening. Dominic, you need to come off mute.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you for keeping perfectly within time to the second. Fergus, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I think I'll probably start just a bit of background in terms of my role in MakeUK. So I'm based in Brussels, and while I'm based here and Ian talking about Britain going baking mad, I will try my best to stay away from the eating of cakes and talking of cherries because they are so topical over here as ever they have been. Perhaps to give a European perspective on where we've come from, where we are now, and the shock that we are seeing. And I think what's been very interesting is how what started as very much a supply side crisis has rapidly become a demand side crisis. At the very start, what we saw was the impact on supply chains and supply chain resilience, particularly from Asian markets. We saw quite a significant concern from our members in terms of being exposed to markets in China and Southeast Asia. And right at the beginning, it was really about identifying where there were weaknesses in your supply chain and trying to identify the impacts. As that started to spread across Europe, it started to become more critical. Where there was some room in terms of your Southeast Asian markets because of the timeline that you build in naturally to that, when Italy started to close, for example, it started having a significant impact. And we saw manufacturers who were exposed to one supplier finding themselves in a position where their entire factory was on the verge of shutdown because one supplier in one country was closed. So I think one of the things which we need to look at in terms of the future is certainly going to be around global supply chains and global supply chain resilience. Now, as I said, we are emerging into what is becoming a much more critical challenge, which is demand. And while there is an opening up of manufacturing across Europe, that demand really is still an issue. Part of that has been from, as Ian has said, behavioral change. So the types of things that people are buying and what people are willing to buy during a crisis has completely changed. But I think I also want to highlight the simple severity of the crisis that we're in at the moment. If you take France as an example, in terms of the short-term working program that they've introduced in France, during the height of the crisis in 2009, 2008, 2009, they had just over 230,000 people on short-time working. Right now, that figure's over 10 million in France. If you look at Germany, the impact on the economy in Germany, estimates were that for every week in lockdown, Germany was losing 1% of GDP. And if you look at what happened in Italy, where pretty much overnight you saw a complete shutdown of the manufacturing sector. And I think one of the lessons which we'll have to learn from this is about coordination. And you saw right at the beginning of this that lots of different countries were doing lots of different things. And there didn't seem to be a lot of coordination across Europe. That in itself has been an overall problem in terms of the shutting of borders. And one of the things that we've seen in terms of our supply chains is the impact on shipping, the impact on road transport, and the impact on aviation. And some of those things which are starting to become evident, which perhaps we knew in the sector, but weren't as widely known in the public. For instance, the importance of Heathrow as our port. It's one of the biggest ports in the UK. Yes, of course, it is a aviation hub in terms of civil aviation, but in terms of freight, there's such a significant amount of freight that goes out of Heathrow, a lot of that actually in passenger aircraft, and a lot of that across the Atlantic. So the shutting down of civil aviation had a huge impact on manufacturing supply chains because of the impact that that has on air freight. You also saw that at the beginning of the crisis, with China and the Southeast Asian market shutting down first, you had long-term or long-distance deep sea shipping in the wrong place. With China shut, ships were empty, they weren't sailing to Europe, so we couldn't get things out of Europe and things couldn't come into Europe. And then you saw the impact across the whole of the European continent on road haulage, with a large number of borders being closed almost overnight, and that having an on-con impact. And then that started to merge into some of the concerns around the workforce. Drivers not wanting to take the risk, workers not wanting to go into factories, but trying to look at some of the positives that are starting to emerge. That fear factor was a particularly key issue in Italy right at the beginning of the crisis, but that seems to be reducing. People want to get back to work, they want to start to go into work, and they want to get their economies going again. If you look at Germany, where I said that they were considerably concerned about the impact on GDP, 1% per week of the lockdown was the estimate. They're now suggesting that the impact of the 2008-2009 crisis, which was originally estimated this crisis to be considerably bigger than that, could be in the same ballpark. And that is quite encouraging to see that. The one caveat, of course, of that in Germany is that they don't want to risk a second peak, a second wave, and therefore a second lockdown. As Ian has already said, that will have a huge impact. In terms of where does this leave us at the moment, I think one of the things which we can learn from this crisis is about that supply chain resilience. And I think that really plays into the future discussions on where do we go next in terms of our global trade strategy. What do we do to ensure that those supply chains are resilient, and trying to learn the lessons about the importance of manufacturing on a global level. We have shown, and I think Ian has made this point about the food sector, we've been overwhelmed by the response of the manufacturing sector, not just in terms of the impact that it's had in some of the terrible figures that we are seeing and continue to see, unfortunately, in the UK manufacturing sector, but also by their response. The fact that we saw factories quickly change to produce new products, the response of the manufacturing sector in the UK to the ventilator challenge, the response in producing PPE, some of those things have just been overwhelming in terms of that response. But it has also highlighted critical weaknesses in our supply chain. And I think that there will be a global debate on manufacturing. There will be a global debate on trade. We started this crisis in a position where the international trade environment in itself was difficult, with increasing nationalism, increasing my country first attitudes, and the erosion of the rules-based system at an international level. And my own personal experiences of being at the WTO Public Forum last year, where everyone, with not a lot of joking, was saying, well, it's been a lot of fun. 25 years is not a bad run, but we don't think there'll be a public forum next year. How interesting we are now that we're talking about that being a virtual summit this year. But actually, I think there's a real message here that actually the resilience of those global supply chains is going to be essential, and it is going to be one of the routes out of this crisis. Dominic, I think your microphone's on mute here.
I'm just about to do it again. I keep on failing to turn off the mute. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you for also keeping perfectly within time. Now, I've got a series of questions to be directed to both of you. I'll start, I think we'll do Ian first and you, and then we'll reverse. The first one actually comes from the CGE trade policy group that we have set up looking at future trade policy for the United Kingdom, originally set up with Brexit in mind, but we think that COVID has an impact on this. They ask in particular that there's been speculation recently that supply chains will, following this pandemic, retrench from a global level to, at the very least, a regional level. How likely do you both believe that to be? And if it does come about, how great a challenge do you think that would be for the future added value of new trade agreements? And do you think it poses a challenge to your members post-transition? Big question.
Well, first of all, I think a lot of this depends on the practicalities of the state of the economies of the various players in any individual set of trading arrangements. So far, it would appear that and that slightly depends on the second peak to which Fergus referred. So if only one country were to have a second peak, that would clearly, apart from the social and personal and human cost, it would massively impact the trading ability of that one country. So leaving that aside, assuming that there isn't a differential in the outturn of the virus itself, I'm a bit sceptical, to be honest, about that. I mean, I think trading patterns are broadly consumer, and I keep going on about shopper, and if necessary, I'll explain why I talk about shoppers rather than consumer. Well, I'll do it now. Shoppers buy things. Shoppers are the active player. Consumers are broadly, not always, but broadly recipients of shoppers' decisions. So if you're selling beer, as I did for 14 years, one of the challenges about Guinness, selling Guinness, the world's most successful and iconic beer, is that quite a lot of people don't like it. And if the shopper is someone who is shopping for, if the consumer is someone who likes Guinness and says to their shopper, please get me some Guinness, and the shopper doesn't like Guinness, the consumer very rarely receives Guinness. And that means that you have to affect the shopper more than you affect the consumer. They're the decision maker. And shoppers like the situation that we've arrived at. They like international trade. They like the balance of products. In food and drink, you can't grow bananas or avocados in the UK, although in fact in Ireland in the 18th century, avocados were grown quite successfully under glass, but we leave that aside because it's not helpful to the argument. But you can't buy those, you can't grow those in the UK, yet people love them. So they will continue to be sold. And I think trade is driven by consumers, and politicians and lunatic demagogues who say America first or buy British, and they're not all lunatics or demagogues who say those things. But when they do say those things, they are in the same position as Canute. They're trying to prove something that cannot be done. You cannot stop in a fantastically connected consumer society that we have now. You can't stop the march of the shopper. So I'm very dubious about the retrenchment of supply chains. Yes, there will be difficulties, but I'm dubious about it. Fergus.
Yeah,
Fergus, over to you.
And I mean, I think, you know, where did we start before we were in this crisis? And I think that there is increasing, as Ian has highlighted, sense of trying to look at my country first policies. And some of that has its own form in Europe as well. If you look at the European Commission being pushed towards technological sovereignty, I mean, that is a protectionist policy by any other name. And so we entered this crisis, in a sense, in a world environment where global trade was being pushed and tested to the limit on that issue anyway. I think actually that the reverse is possibly true, that actually through this crisis we have come to understand global supply chains much more, and actually the impact and the negative impact of those isolationist type of policies are clearly showing themselves to not have been successful. And therefore, there is a greater pressure towards that. And certainly what we're hearing from the membership is that while they are going to look at their supply chains, they are obviously going to look at their export strategies. It isn't about reshoring. That isn't the top priority. In terms of looking more broadly across the European Union, I think the interconnectedness of manufacturing supply chains, I think it's the weakness element that people will look at, not the origin element. So I think what people will look at is it really sensible to have had one supplier of brakes for my car in one country? Probably the answer to that is no, and they might look at, or even, was it right to have one Chinese supplier of one piece of equipment for my factory that stopped me working for 2 weeks? Those sort of questions I think will certainly be asked. But I think there is a great opportunity to capitalize on the spotlight which has been shone on manufacturing supply chains at the moment.
Thank you very much. Next question from Martin Smith, which is in some ways runs on from this. He says, it seems to me that there's a lot of missing detail on the operation of trade for ro-ro freight post-Brexit, partly because this isn't an issue in the Canada trade deal, which is claimed to be the base of our negotiating strategy for a future relationship. Do you have any timetable from government on when more detailed guidance may become available? And what are your members reporting about their preparations for new customs and border procedures? Fergus, will you go first on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of answering that question, perhaps in reverse, where members are at the moment is they're dealing with the crisis which is in front of them. And right now, that for some businesses is keeping the doors open next week. And I don't want to be dramatic about it. For some, it is that critical. So at the moment, that is where their focus is, and rightly, that's where our focus is on their behalf. In terms of the timetable, I think that we understood that work was ongoing. It has been slowed down because of the crisis and because of the bandwidth within government. I don't have any date in terms of when that is likely to emerge, but clearly that is going to be an essential part of the deal. I think if you look at our routes to market, they tend to be across the Dover Straits, and a lot of that is ro-ro activity. Now, updates that I have had from negotiations in Brussels, from both the UK side and from the EU side, there is a technical table which is discussing that. So although it doesn't show itself necessarily in legal text, they are live to it and they are discussing it in Brussels.
Dominic, I don't have really anything to add to Fergus's astonishingly expert view. Well, not astonishing given the job he's got, but anyway. But the only thing I would say is that there is sometimes what we have learned through the COVID-19 crisis is one or two surprising things about the way specific products are traded, or brand or product sectors are traded, and the way they physically move. So despite the fact I've been leading the food and drink industry, or leading the body which represents the food and drink industry much more accurately, for the last 5 years, I only discovered about 3 months ago that most seafood of any quality is transported in the belly of passenger aeroplanes. So I had no idea that scallops, lobsters, and other crawly things that I'm not allowed to eat were transported both here, to here, and from here in passenger aeroplanes, because it's the only way you can keep them fresh. And so trade in those has ceased broadly. And there will be many other situations of different things, not to do with food and drink at all, but there will be other things which have to be transported in those ways. And so these separate specifics are crucially important and often only become evident because those who trade them do not reveal that, or don't feel the need to, because they've got anybody to tell, until the mechanism is threatened.
Thank you very much. Just linked into that, are those the things that you've picked up? Is it your impression that that's being taken on board with the Brexit negotiations? There seems to me to be an overlap here, because to an extent, some of the interruptions in supply chains that we've seen with COVID are things which could happen depending on the nature of the agreements we have at the end of transition. And I just wondered whether there were signs that lessons were being learnt from COVID which could be translated over, if there are any which can be.
Well, for us, it's the other way around. So the fact that we had spent umpteen meetings, God knows how many meetings, and time preparing for 3 no-deal Brexits which didn't happen, was the reason that we were so ready for this. And incidentally, and I will say this now, DEFRA's performance through this as a department has been exemplary. Its involvement, engagement, and dealing with us as its members has been remarkable. And this is not a sentence some months ago I ever expected to say, but George Eustace has played an absolute blinder. He has been an exemplary minister. He is a tremendously effective minister in the sense that he, unlike 1 or 2 other people that I might already have mentioned, he not only does he know, first of all, he knows his limitations, where other ministers don't even realise there are things called limitations. And he is extremely good at making sure that where he has gaps, his civil servants are the best he can have to fill those gaps. So the planning stuff that Gove, in fact, put in place has been used relentlessly, and it's the other way round for food and drink. Now, I hope that because they've learned that way around, the DEFRA crew will do that in reverse, taking the COVID lessons and putting them into practice for the next crisis.
Fergus, anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think, other than to reiterate Ian's point about the support that we've had from colleagues in government to the crisis, they have acted fast, and they have acted to support the sector. I don't think the opportunity will be missed to learn from this and to understand the importance of supply chains and how they work. And certainly, from a European perspective, the crisis has really changed the thinking on the European continent as well. And I think that the budget which was released this week in Brussels and the recovery package is just an indication of how much they are learning from this and how much it is going to influence the coming 5, 6, and probably the coming decade.
Thank you. Next question from Michael Clough. The Immigration Act is going through Parliament at the moment. What impact do you see that having on your members? I see Ian burying his head in his hands. And what representations might the CGE be making to influence MPs in a way that might be helpful to your businesses? Ian?
Well, I have to be careful here. Priti Patel used to work for me. Indeed, she worked for someone else on this call, Mark Leverton, my very good friend. And listen, when you next meet, you've got to ask him why he did it, because it's all his fault. I think the Immigration Act, I think the government's whole immigration policy is hugely ill-judged from a business point of view. Obviously, you might have guessed I'm coming from a completely, not dissimilar from some of you, tradition of instinct. Prime Minister likes instincts, doesn't he? But from a business point of view, it makes no sense. Because now, the only thing I would say here is where people like me do have to just have a pause for breath, is that we've talked a lot about British people not being prepared to do picking jobs, to do those sorts of relatively low level jobs in social care and in other settings. Well, what we don't know is how that will work when we've got 5 million people who are unemployed. Because up until now, we've had full employment, super full employment actually. So in many cases, really, really big shortages. And that is going to change. So I think people like me have to just pause for thought there. But honestly, if anybody could draw the lessons of the last 3 months and look at at the level of commitment and indeed the level of sacrifice that those who have come to this country, either themselves or their families, have made in the national interest, and then allow that act in its current form to go through, then I cannot understand how they can possibly put together cause and effect, or how they can consider what the impact on business and the effectiveness of employers and organisations to function will be. And anything you can do, frankly, anything you can do to mitigate that from a practical point of view, never mind the ideology, from the practical point of view of it's bad for business.
Fergus?
I guess, again, looking at this from the opposite end of the prism, from Brussels looking in, I think there's a sense here. I mean, it is one of the issues that our European counterpart organisations across Europe are most concerned about is mobility and understanding how that is going to be affected in the future. I think probably the thing I would say as a message back from Brussels is that it is an issue for the EU that reciprocal arrangements is what they're going to start on the basis. And I think it shouldn't be forgotten that the ability to move within the free single market will be dependent on what the UK does in terms of its immigration policy. And that, I think, has been made clear in terms of the attitude from Brussels. And I think that while we as a European manufacturing sector want to see as much mobility as possible, it also draws onto one of the more challenging elements of the negotiation because of the subsidiarity issue and the competence issue. With the UK being a third country, that is a national competence, and we saw that in the no-deal planning, that actually draws a real difficulty for the Commission in terms of doing something across the whole 27, when actually that's a national competence. And it's going to be a particularly difficult part of the negotiations, I suspect.
Thank you. Ian, you're back again, but I'd lost you for a second. So.
Yes, sorry about that.
That's all right. Another question from CGE Trade Policy Group. And this is about the Irish Protocol, which has been topical this week. There's clearly a substantial gap between what the UK government and EU Commission believe is necessary to implement the Irish Protocol, even if the United Kingdom now seems to accept that implementation is necessary and required, even in the event of no deal. Once new rules are agreed, how long will your members need to adapt, and what are the issues you need clarity on? And what are you warning your members about regarding traffic issues at UK-EU border and the GB Northern Ireland border? Fergus.
Lot to unpackage there. I mean, as I said, I think at the moment, you know, what we're working with our members on is the current crisis, and in terms of as much certainty as we can get on some of these issues going forward. The one thing I think with a European reflection on this is not to be underestimated is how much weighs on the application of the withdrawal agreement and the delivery of the commitments under that here in Brussels. A lot of conversations that I've had with member states and with those close to the negotiations from the EU side do see genuinely a landing zone for the future. They are willing to look at compromises to try and bridge the gap between where the UK position is and the EU positions are. But they are looking to the application of the withdrawal agreement and the delivery of those commitments, because they think that that structure is likely to be the structure which will be used to deliver the full future relationship. So I just would iterate the fact that the feeling from Brussels is they are watching with an absolute keen interest what is going to happen on the Northern Ireland Protocol, on the delivery of that, at a level of detail, not at a high level of aspiration, and on citizens' rights. And that I don't think it should be underestimated in the UK how much of that is going to be a proof point for the Europeans on this.
I would just add one. I'd go a bit. I mean, I think everything Sir Fergus has said has been absolutely right. And in Northern Ireland, in relation to food and drink, there'll be one key test, I suspect. I think stuff going from Northern Ireland, the key issue is the stuff that goes from UK or GB, sorry, to Northern Ireland, and indeed to a degree to the Republic, but mainly to Northern Ireland. That's the key test for, in many ways, because if it becomes too expensive or too onerous to take stuff from Northern Ireland, from the GB to Northern Ireland, and either to Northern Ireland and it reposes itself there, or to Northern Ireland and on to the Republic, then the first thing that will happen is that retailers who are dependent on that product moving across will stop participating in those markets. So Marks and these are just a few that do participate. So the participation levels are different. Some play in Northern Ireland and don't play in the Republic. Some play across both sides of the border. Some only play in the Republic. But still, the movement of goods is almost exclusively, as I understand it, through Northern Ireland and further, and stays there or goes south. And if it becomes too expensive or too onerous, those businesses are only marginally profitable anyway. So if it becomes too expensive, and in the current COVID position, you know, businesses are even more cost conscious. They're not doing instead of not doing the last 5% because it's too risky, they're not doing the last 15%, then those businesses will close. And it's okay for the UK government if those businesses, it's not good for anybody, but it's okay for the UK government if those businesses close in the Republic because there aren't any voters there, UK voters, well, very few. If one of the big retailers, or even more of the big retailers, food and drink retailers, in Northern Ireland close and reduce the amount of choice that those shoppers and consumers have, although they can't directly impact the fortunes of the UK government because British political parties don't stand there, that will have severe consequences for their perception of how much the UK government really cares about Northern Ireland. And that could be crucial in a future border poll.
Thank you very much. Question from Robert Morland, which links both COVID and Brexit. So most of these questions seem to link both COVID and Brexit. Given the United Kingdom has invariably supported moves in the EU Council to lower farm prices and to reduce EU agricultural expenditure, are you now expecting, both post-COVID and Brexit, UK food prices to fall along with agricultural expenditure, or do you expect that pressure from farmers will lead to prices and agricultural expenditure to rise because farmers will be given funding in the name of money for the environment or indeed recovery? Ian, would you like to have a go at that?
Not particularly, but I will. I don't think, I'm very dubious in the, I think the COVID impact on price will be to keep them low. I think in a situation where you've got 5 million people, 6 million people unemployed, and industrial and economic output may be suppressed, and there are difficult times, unless you've got another kicker to inflation that I can't think of, you're going to have a real, this country has had food price deflation for pretty much the last 20 years, really. And that's partly down to competition, the insane level of competition between the supermarkets, which is great in many ways for shoppers and consumers. The only possible impact to this is if, and I don't say this with any sense of relish actually, if those who are currently reviewing food strategy in this country start to bring a number of extra burdens on the industry, which may for other social reasons be either desirable or at least arguable, then there could be a kicker. I incidentally don't think that trade talks between ourselves and the Americans will bring lower prices, because I just do not think that the British consumer, the UK consumer, is very, very keen on high standard product. And whatever happens, they're going to go on being keen on high standard product. And even if there's some attempt to bring in other product that's labelled in some way that, I don't know how it could possibly say other than this is produced to a different standard or something. I just don't see that as a serious impact in the short term on prices. So I don't think either of the factors which the question included drive prices in any specific way. I think the economic conditions will be the key determinant.
Thank
you, Fergus. Is there anything you want to add on that?
I mean, when it comes to the food sector, Ian is the one to ask. The one thing I would say is
possibly not, mate. Possibly not.
One thing I would say is, looking sort of more broadly beyond the impact that COVID is having, the crisis is having. The EU published its 7-year budget this week, and it was markedly, or it was certainly worth looking at the fact that CAP is one of the areas which is under target for reduction. Now, this is something that frugal countries across Europe have been calling for. So it is having an impact across the board, and that wouldn't have happened without COVID.
Thank you very much. Now, I've got a question from College Bramall, which probably start with you, Fergus, which is about the pharmaceutical industry and what the lessons are, again, from COVID, and whether they have relevance to the risks of no deal and what would happen within the pharmaceutical sector.
I'm afraid I'm not close enough to the pharmaceutical sector to really take an honest stab at that question. I'm very sorry. I can take it away and get something back to you, but I wouldn't want to jump into that.
Ian, is it outside your area, or was there anything you wanted to put in on that?
Dominic, I know a lot about drink, and I used to work for drugs, but I don't know anything about pharmaceuticals. So I'm afraid I can't answer that.
Thank you. Nicholas McLean has asked this question, which again is moving from COVID back to Brexit. But the government's made, or appears to be making it pretty clear, that it does not want an extension of transition. And that raises the risk of no deal. Although I suppose there's also a risk of no deal at the end of transition, an extension of transition. What are your views about extending transition? Do you have one? Fergus. Actually, I'll start with Ian, because I know he's got to slip away in about 3 or 4 minutes.
That's right. And can I, because this will probably be my last answer, can I preface that by saying, first of all, it's been a huge pleasure, such fun. And I really would like, this is me inviting myself, I'd like to come back when I can see you all, because it would be such fun to be with so many nice people and good friends, and to have a longer debate on all these very important issues. And I apologise for the fact that I have to go. I think on an extension to the transition, I would say our view, these are my views, and then I'll tell you what the FDF view is. My view is it's bonkers to try and negotiate with a timescale when you're in a situation where not only do you not know what your own economy will look like, indeed your own society will look like in 3 months or 6 months or 9 months, but you have no idea what the counterparty's society or economy will look like either. And nobody would do a business negotiation like that. They'd simply say, stop the clock. They'd say, we'll come back to this, unless there was a distressed purchase opportunity. They'd say, stop the clock, we'll come back when we'll continue in our current trading relationship, and we'll see how this develops. Now, I do not understand the logic on either side of continuing, continuing to do this. But if that's what they're going to do, it's pretty. I think asking for an extension to the transition is basically a waste of time. I'm rather with. I was about to say I'm rather with Keir Hardie on that. That's a mistake, isn't it? I'm rather with Keir Starmer on that. Actually, Keir Hardie would probably take the same view, but boring old sod. But I'm rather. I think the government says it wants a deal. We want a deal. Everybody I know wants a deal. So let's take them at their word and let's see what deal they have. And what we're going to do is tell them, here's the deal we want, plonk, and we're going to try and hold them to that account. I think that behind this question is, what do I think will happen at the end of this? I do think if we end up getting, I think the Prime Minister is right actually on this, as on so many other things. He says that he thinks there will be a deal, but it will be last minute. I think there will be a deal and it will be last minute. And in your ranks is, Dominic, apart from yourself, who I'm sure knows the answer to this far better than either of us, Sir David Liddington also knows the answer to this. So what I suggest is when I've gone away, you ask him, because he'll tell you. Thanks very much, everybody. I'm really, really sorry I have to go. And can I say it was a great pleasure to appear with my mate Fergus, who's, and we're actually, McReynolds and Wright are available for christenings, weddings and bar mitzvahs when they're freely available. And I look forward to returning at some point in the near future. Dominic, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Ian, very much for your time. Much appreciated and very stimulating discussion. Have a pleasant evening. Bye. I'll turn to you, Fergus. You want to come in on the back of that?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's always easiest to follow Ian in terms of where things are. Look, I think Ian has hit the nail on the head. I think on this one, I think what we're trying to deal with at the moment is the crisis which is right in front of us. We are going out to members to have this conversation. I don't think it's any secret that clearly representations are being made behind the scenes. But I think at the moment, the government has made their position very clear on extension. But Brussels is a art, or deals with in Brussels are an art of the fudge. They are an art of finding the way through the unassailable, or the trying to find a route to things which seemed impossible. So I think that there is certainly optimism here about getting a deal, but I think it probably comes back to interpreting what was the transition period for, and I think that is one of the issues which is being felt hard in Brussels at the moment, which is transition was always envisaged as the time to prepare. Brussels thinks that there is an opportunity, if you need more time to prepare, to extend it. They think they've made their position very clear on that. But I think that there is a mismatch of the understanding on what the transition period is for and was for. And that certainly it isn't necessarily the thing that decides the timetable of the negotiations. It is a period which allows for transition from one state to another. But I think in terms of that decision, it may be after the negotiations next week and the high-level conference that becomes the topic, and that people consider their positions. But I think as it stands at the moment, the government have made their position very clear on that. And I think the EU side have as well. I think I understand from some of your colleagues, Dominic, that you were speaking to David McAllister recently. And I have also spoken to him, and interesting that he has taken the position, which, you know, my position, but I'm not going to talk about it because I don't want to get involved in it. And I think that that's the prevailing view here in Brussels. Is I think Brussels at a European level thinks it's a very sensible idea to have the option to extend and to extend it. But I think that they think.
Thank you very much. And I'm conscious that we are on 1929, and I think, therefore, we have to bring this evening to a close. So first of all, my thanks to you, Fergus, echoing what I said earlier to Ian, but particular thanks that you've come and joined us. We're hugely appreciative. The survival of this organisation is dependent on our being able to do these webinars at the moment. I shall just come on in a moment just to point out to members that if the CGE is to flourish, we need to have our meetings, we need to have their support, and we couldn't have their support without having the meetings. So thank you very much indeed.
And thank you very much as well for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you.